Welcome to the 2023 Fleeceling Quilt Along. I'm Laura Struck from Made Peachy, and over this series of videos we're going to work towards creating a sampler quilt. This 9-block sampler quilt features a selection of products from the Fleeceling quilting range, and each video will walk you through the process of start to finish to create each unique quilting block. Block number 9 in the sampler quilt is a ribbon block or a ribbon star block, and this has been made with Fleeceling Quilter's Grid. Block number 9 in the sampler quilt is a block that features a 4-pointed star. It's sometimes called a ribbon block or a ribbon star block, and I'm going to create it using the Fleeceling Quilter's Grid. The supplies we need for the block are some fabrics. I've chosen a light and dark fabric to create a contrast, and our rotary cutter, ruler and mat. Fleeceling Quilter's Grid is a fusible interlining, and it has a grid marked onto the wrong side. So we have one side with our 1-inch square grid and the other side is fusible for us to apply our fabrics. Because this is a fusible product, I'm going to be using the Fleeceling iron-on, which is a pressing cloth that allows me to see my work whilst I'm pressing it onto the fusible interlining. The ribbon block or the ribbon star block is made with a combination of squares and half square triangles. To begin, I've cut a piece of Quilter's Grid 9 squares by 9 squares, and this gives me the foundation for the design. And then the fabrics, we need a central motif, which is 3-inch square. And as the finished half square triangles also need to be 3-inch square, I'm going to create those from 4 squares, 2 in each of the colours, and they measure 4 3/4 square. The finished block uses 8 of the 3-inch half square triangles. There's a number of different methods that you can use to create half square triangles. The method I'm going to use will create 4 each time. So I'm going to begin by placing my fabrics right side to right side. These fabrics measure 4 3/4 inches square. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to work around all 4 sides, taking a 1/4 inch seam. And then I'm going to cut the fabrics diagonally and diagonally again, and these will open out to make 4 half square triangles that measure 3 inches square. You may prefer to mark on your stitching line with a removable marker, perhaps a air erase or heat erase marker, and this can speed up the process and give you a lovely accurate finish. So I'm just going to work all the way around, adding in the lines as stitching guide to show where I'm going to be stitching. So this is going to join the 2 blocks together. And once it's seamed, I'm going to be cutting, so I can also add the cut lines, which will help me later. So it's working diagonally through the center and rotating, and I'm going to be cutting my second line diagonally through the center. Before I sew these, I like to just pop a pin in just to ensure the fabrics don't drift, so perhaps 1 on each side, and then I can head to the sewing machine to sew the block. Over at the sewing machine, I'm going to be working a straight stitch along this marked line, which is a 1/4 inch from the raw edge, and we're going to work that round all 4 sides. I'm using a size 80 needle and a 50-weight thread, so I'm going to have nice neat stitching without too much bulk on the seam allowance. I've selected a 2mm stitch, and I'm just following that line all the way along, and to get to the point, simply lift the presser foot and pivot to work the remaining sides. With the 4 seams being worked, we're now ready to follow and cut along our lines to release the half square triangles. So taking the ruler, just simply aligning with the corners, following the cutting guide if you've drawn one on, and simply snipping, and then I'm going to rotate my mat, reposition my ruler along that cutting line, and cut again. And what we now have are 4 half square triangles that are going to measure exactly 3 inches across. Our half square triangles are made with a light and dark fabric, so when I open these out I need to press my seams towards the darker fabric. In doing so, I'm going to ensure that all of my fabrics are tucked away under that dark fabric and won't be visible on the finished piece. When all of the half square triangles have been pressed, we can neaten up each individual one by removing the excess on the seam allowance. So simply taking the rotary cutter and ruler and just slicing away the excess that comes over from the seam allowance. This quilt actually uses 8 of these half square triangles, so we need to repeat the entire process and make a further 4, and then we're ready to start building our design. I'm going to use the quilter's grid on my pressing mat. So I have my pressing mat and the grid side is facing down. I'm doing that because this side here, the rough side, is the adhesive side, and that's where I want to fuse the fabrics. And I'm going to go ahead and place my cut squares on top of the grid to create the design. So this design is worked by 3 rows of 3 blocks, and we just begin by placing the blocks in turn to create this ribbon effect, this ribbon star effect. So there's a star is going to appear in the center as we work. So I'm just carefully placing the blocks in rows of 3 by 3, and at the center we're going to be positioning the plain block, and following around we can start to see that the star motif is appearing. And adding the final 2 squares, and that reveals our ribbon block or ribbon star. With all the fabrics placed, the next process is to fuse all the fabrics ready for us to stitch. So I'm going to cover this with a damp pressing cloth. I'm using the Fleeceline iron-on cloth, and you'll see straight away the reason I use this is because when it's damp, it becomes transparent. So I can see that the process of me laying the cloth down hasn't caused any of those fabric blocks to drift. Also, you'll see where I've got some slight gaps here, I'm not going to have the problem of that sticking to my iron where the adhesive is visible, because the pressing cloth is going to take care of that. So I'm just going to make sure all of my blocks are where I want them, and I'm going to begin pressing. To fuse the fabrics onto the quilter's grid, I'm using a medium heat on the iron, and I'm going to use a pressing technique. So I'm just going to press for a few seconds, lift and replace and press again. So I don't have any steam in the iron, I'm just using the damp iron-on cloth. So press and hold, and working all the way across until the entire design has been fused. Once the entire surface has been fused, I can carefully peel away the pressing cloth. Of course, everything that you iron is going to feel hot, so just taking a little bit of care. You can see where I've been a bit aggressive with my trimming down of my blocks. I'm actually catching the adhesive on the pressing cloth, which is great because that saved the base plate of my iron. And I don't need to worry about any of these gaps because this is where I'm going to be working my seams, and these sections will be caught in the seam allowance. When a piece has just been fused, it still remains quite hot, so I'm going to take it off of my pressing mat, carefully place it onto the table, and this is going to allow it to cool fully. This means that not only will it be easier to work with, it will allow the adhesive to fully bond to the fabric and give it a nice secure bond. After around 30 minutes, the fabrics will have completely cooled, and they will also have allowed the adhesive time to fully set, so the fabrics will be really strongly bonded onto the quilter's grid. To finish off the block, we need to work some vertical seams and some horizontal seams. And these are going to be worked by folding the project over, stitching using the line as a guide, and then opening to reveal the enclosed seam. So these sections where the fabrics don't meet will all be hidden, enclosed in the seam. So I'll begin by working this vertical seam. So I'm going to rotate the work, and on the wrong side, I'm looking for the brown line. So it's the third square in, and I'm just going to carefully finger press that in place and pop some clips on just to hold it steady, ready to be stitched. So I've secured the section that I want to be seaming, and I'm going to be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. So a 1/4 inch from this folded edge working all the way along right to the end to create that first vertical seam. Over at the sewing machine, I have positioned my fabric so that I can stitch 1/4 inch from this folded edge. I'm going to work a straight stitch the whole way down. So I'll bring my needle down. My needle is a size 80 and I'm working with a 50 weight thread for this piecing section. So using a 2mm stitch, just following all the way along, removing any clips and pins, just working the whole length of that vertical seam. With the first vertical seam having been worked there 1/4 inch from this folded edge, I can open this out. We can take a look and we can reveal the first portion. So I'm going to repeat the process to fold, find the grid line on the reverse, and I'm going to just clip those in place and again work a line of stitching that runs the whole length of that second vertical seam. Now that we've worked this second seam, I'm going to open up the block and press out slightly, and we can see that we've got 2 vertical seams completed, and now we need to move on and work the horizontal seams. It's worked in the same manner, so we're going to be folding the fabrics over and stitching along on the reverse. Before we do so, I'm just going to take a look at the back of the work. If we were to simply fold and stitch, we're going to end up with quite a lot of bulk at these intersections with the horizontal and vertical seams. The easiest way to combat that is to take a pair of sharp scissors and just simply snip at the section where the 2 elements will meet. So I'm just making a small snip, being sure I'm not catching my stitching line. So that's the 4 sections that are going to meet with the second seams. So return my work and fold over. I'm finding that brown grid line and I'm going to press along. The difference this time is, rather than having my seam allowances of this folded section sitting directly on top of each other, I'm going to nest them. So I'm going to have one placed in one direction and one placed in the other. A clip is a really helpful way just to hold them in that orientation. And again on this side, so that one of the seam allowances on one side and one on the other. And that's ready to take over to the sewing machine, and we can work a line of stitching running the whole length of that seam. Over at the machine, I'm using my 2mm stitch and taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just carefully working all the way along, ensuring that when I get to the intersection of the horizontal and vertical, that those sections are separated and they nest neatly in opposite directions, working all the way to the end. The first horizontal seam has been stitched and our bulk at the corners has all been nested. And I can press that open and we can take a look, and we can now see how the block is going to appear. So we've just got one final seam line here to be worked, and that's done in exactly the same manner, remembering to nest the sections where the 2 sides of the seams meet. With the final horizontal seam having been stitched, we can open out the block and take a look at the finished design. Taking time to just carefully press out the block will really bring out the motif. So just working over with the iron. If you're concerned if you have any quilter's grid that is exposed on the outer elements of your block, simply cover with your piece of Bleaseline iron-on cloth and work over. And that will just protect the base of your iron from coming into contact with any adhesive. And now the ribbon star block is ready to quilt. Be sure to check out the other videos in the series to create all 9 blocks of your sampler quilt. You can find our Quilt as you go method video in the series also, and this will show you how to piece together your finished sampler quilt. Thank you so much for joining me for the Bleaseline 2023 Quilt Along. You can find out more about the Bleaseline products on the Bleaseline website at bleaseline.com, and you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Bleaseline UK. You can find me online at madepeachy.com. Please do share your projects online and tag us in your makes.
We do love to see them.